So a number of years ago, there was an associate pastor here named Dave Peters, and some of you may remember him. He preached a sermon one time that stuck with me, and the title of the sermon was, "So Soon?" You hear the question mark? So soon? And as I recall, he whipped out a credit card and he said, "Aren't these things wonderful? When we have that need for instant gratification, we may not have the money in our pocket, but we can get it. We can get it right now." That need for instant gratification. And then he said that sometimes we have that same need regarding our faith. We want all the answers and we want them now. And his message then was, so soon? In other words, our faith is really a lifelong journey. And that's what I'm talking about today. And I'm inviting you to think about your journey. When did it begin? Think about faith. What does that mean? How would you define it? Is there such a thing as good faith and bad faith? Is it necessary maybe even to have some questions in order to have faith? I'm going to present a few ideas from the Bible about faith and some from some theologians about faith, and then I'm going to share a little bit about my faith journey. Of course, in the Bible, faith is a recurring theme. You'll see it a lot of places. We heard about it in the reading from Habakkuk, and I'll admit, in my 80-something years that I've been going to church, I don't remember ever hearing of a Bible book called Habakkuk. But it's there. And I thought the story is sort of interesting because he was a man who was called by God to warn people of their impending doom. And he wasn't afraid to talk to God and to question God. And when he did question him, then the answer was, "The just shall live by their faith." As Pat said, that verse has been repeated in the New Testament many times as one of God's great promises. The just shall live by their faith. And then I read from Matthew the story about the mustard seed. We've often heard that before, I think. And Jesus said to the disciples, "If you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you." Now, we know that Jesus often made his point with parables and with allegories and with metaphors. And so when he's speaking of moving a mountain, maybe he was talking about a mountain of care that we might be having, a problem that we're having to solve that seems like a mountainous problem. Perhaps that's what he was saying. Or perhaps he was saying that something, your faith, even as tiny as a mustard seed, can achieve great things. In Hebrews, the second reading, the faith chapter, as Robert Schuller called it, we heard that wonderful definition of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Schuller also referred to that cloud of witnesses that were listed as the Scriptural Hall of Fame. And it ended with those inspiring words, "By faith, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Some things that some theologians have said. There was a theologian named Søren Kierkegaard. He was a 19th century Danish immigrant, philosopher, poet, critic, religious author, and he was considered to be the first existentialist philosopher. Now, I had to look up that word because I wasn't sure what existentialist would be. And what I found was existentialism is a belief that we are each responsible for creating purpose or meaning in our own lives. Kierkegaard coined the term a leap of faith. Now, there are things that we believe, things that we see and can touch and can feel, we believe. But what about those things that we can't see? And that's where he was talking about the only way, he said, to understand God is through the leap of faith from logic to the unexplainable. Another theologian was Paul Tillich, and he was a German-American Christian existentialist philosopher. And he was considered, he was a Lutheran theologian and was considered one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. His famous quote about faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. Many of you know that we used to go away in the winter, get away from winter, went down to Hilton Head, and we attended church services there. And the pastor, his name was John Miller, and he spoke one time about this sentence, faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. And he said, I think Tillich wanted to suggest that the sole subject of genuine faith is faith in God. If we have faith at all, it is faith in God. God is, Tillich said, our ultimate concern. Now, just as a little aside about Paul Tillich, my husband was working on an MBA program at Harvard, and in his first year at the Harvard Memorial Church, they get a lot of famous theologians that would come and speak, and Paul Tillich was there and spoke, and Bob Herding with some of his friends. And when the service was over, they were standing outside talking about it, and one of them said, wow, isn't that great? And the other one said, oh my, what an intellect, he's wonderful. And it came to Bob, and he said, I didn't understand a word he said. And the next guy said, I really didn't either. And when it ended up, all of them agreed that they really didn't understand the sermon. So I guess sometimes a great intellect is hard to understand. Now I have one more quote from not really a theologian. This one comes from Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was an English-American author and journalist. He is regarded as one of the most influential atheists of the 20th and 21st century. You may have heard him and not realized it because he would be on talk shows. He had very, very strong political views and religious views. And in fact, he wrote a book called God is Not Great. So why am I mentioning Christopher Hitchens? Well, he had a quote regarding Kierkegaard, and he said, actually, the leap of faith is an imposture. As Kierkegaard himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on, being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. Now, I would change mounting evidence to perceived evidence, and I would say, sorry, Hitchens, he's rolling over in his grave, but I think he makes a good argument for the supposition that faith is a lifelong journey. My story started back when I was about 10 years old, I should say. I was an only child. We were a church-going family. We went every Sunday, and I believed everything I was told. That's it. When I was in about the 5th grade, my mother went back to work, and I became a latchkey kid. So I wore a key around my neck, a ribbon, and every day I walked home from school. I could let myself in, I have my milk and cookies, do my homework, wait for my folks. But one day I got home and realized I had left my key at home, and I couldn't get in. Now, don't worry about me, because there was an agreement with our neighbors, so I could always go there. They had children that I played with, and so I wasn't abandoned. But I wanted to get in my house that day. So I knew that the back door of the laundry room wasn't locked, but there was a screen door that had one of those little hooks. And it's funny, just today I noticed there's one of those hooks in that bathroom, in case you don't know what I'm talking about. But it was not very sturdy, and sometimes it didn't catch. So I thought, if I go back there and I jiggle that door and I pray to God, that door will open. I can jiggle it out. So I jiggled and I prayed and I jiggled and I prayed, and guess what? It didn't open. And I thought, wait a minute. I'm a good girl and I prayed for this. What's with that, God? Why didn't you help me open the door? Of course, later in life, I've come to realize that it's not that God doesn't hear, it's that sometimes the answer is no, but I didn't think of that at that time. I was disappointed, and it was like a little chink in my faith. And I carried that with me, obviously, I still remember, but we kept going to church. And even one summer, my grandmother I spent 2 weeks with her, and she took me to a revival meeting. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever experienced a Southern revival meeting, but I can tell you there's a lot of hellfire and damnation that's talked about, a lot of emphasis on sin. So file that away in my memory. So by the time I'm about 14, somehow I got really concerned about this concept of hell. I kept thinking, well, if somebody's a really good person, and how about if they never even heard of Jesus for some reason? They couldn't go to heaven, so they would go to hell. I mean, it just bothered me. I was 14. So I carried that with me then. Now, fast forward to I'm 21. And I was very fortunate. I got a job as a secretary to a professor at Harvard. His name was Frank Moore Cross, and he was a Presbyterian minister, a biblical archaeologist. He was working on deciphering the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very interesting person to work for. And at Harvard, they had a Wednesday chapel service every Wednesday, and the different preachers took turns doing the sermon. And when it was my boss's turn, I went. And it may be hyperbole in a way, but the sermon that day really, I think, changed my life. At least it changed my spiritual life. Because his message was, it's okay to question. Because I worried a lot about that. I thought, am I being a hypocrite if I go to church? If I question anything, if I don't believe everything I'm told, if I doubt, am I being a fake Christian, really? But he said, it's okay to question. It's okay to doubt. What's not okay is to close the door, is to stop looking for the answers. In other words, that faith is a lifelong journey. So wherever you are today in your faith journey, stay the course and know that God is with you always. Amen.